Hey Bookaholics, so welcome back to another video. Today I am bringing you my August wrap up. In the month of August, I gave you a TBR that was chock-a-block full of books, and I have selected from that pile which ones I have fancied reading. I haven't read all of them, but I have read a decent amount of them, so let's get into the books. I'm going to start out with book club reads that I have been reading for read-alongs, book clubs, etc., and then I'll get into the series that I read. So, starting out with the book club picks, the first one that I have to talk about is The Tongues of Serpents by Naomi Novik. This one is for my book club that I am hosting with my friend Eleanor over at the channel Eleanor Lichvata. All of the information will be in the description down below. This one is book 6 in the Temeraire series. The Temeraire series is a 9-book series in which this is, as I said, the 6th installment, and it is the Napoleonic Wars but with dragons. In the first book, we follow Captain Will Lawrence, who takes over a French vessel during the wars, but the vessel happens to be holding a dragon egg. Dragons being invaluable to the war effort means that given this egg is about to hatch, one of his crew are going to have to take the hit and bond with it. When the dragon selects Will as his rider, he must give up all of the life that he has known to become the constant companion of the fighting dragon Temeraire. This one is book 6, and in this one, after having travelled all over the world in all of the other books, we are in Australia. And this is arguably, out of the books, and I have actually read book 7 and can confirm this, the most disappointing book in the installment so far. I have very little to say on this book. I was thoroughly disappointed. It was a considerable dip and lull in this series. As I said, I have since read book 7, which is a step up again, and we're back to regular scheduled program. But this one was so disappointing, and I was very excited for it because I was interested to see how Naomi Novik would handle the social commentary that she has been using throughout the rest of the series to discuss Australia, especially during colonial times during the Napoleonic Wars. But we only really saw colonial Australia. We only really saw Darwin and the typical just places that you would see during colonial times. So I don't feel like we immersed as much as I wanted to. There were some interesting discussions around especially the dragons, but personally I was a bit disappointed by this book, and I'm glad that I got, as soon as September rolled around, I'm glad that I got straight into Temeraire so that I could dispel the idea that the series was on a downward spiral, because I did really enjoy the next one. So sad dip, but we move on. Another book club read that was sadly a bit disappointing is The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. I read this as part of the Readalong that Stephen Arion over on his channel is hosting, and this one is the first book in the Licanius trilogy. In this first book, we are following a young man who lives in this sort of monastery-esque establishment, which is where people who have presented magical abilities go, and they have to undertake a test in which they prove what their abilities are so that they then might be essentially categorized. It's a bit of a Harry Potter takedown, in my opinion. And then if you do not have any of the necessary powers, or you're not able to pass the trial, then you get turned into what is a shadow, which is, it seems like someone takes your soul. And then we have this young man who has not been able to display any kind of magic, so he knows that he is going to become a shadow, until one of the mentors comes and says that there is this barrier that is up in the north that is keeping all of these monsters at bay from entering into their world, but the barrier is fading, and he believes that this boy is not able to show his magical abilities because he has these other different magical abilities which would be very useful up at the wall. So then embarks him going on a quest to try and get to the wall, and that is this book. It's literally just this dude trying to get to this wall and the political machinations that come with that. And there's the whole good guys versus bad guys. There's like, you're not sure which of these boys is actually going to be potentially this evil person and which one is going to be the savior, and I don't know. You could read John Gwynne and he does it better. I really struggled with this book. I am going to continue. I was interested in the way it ended, and I am hopeful that this book was just a starting point. It was just your entry point, and that things are going to get much more interesting in books 2 and 3, that they are going to be more innovative and have a bit more ingenuity, because this one was just Fantasy 101. It was just how to write a fantasy book. It didn't bring anything new to the table for me personally. Also, as someone who's not much of a hard magic fan, that also didn't really work for me, but that's not the book's fault. However, I did find, one, the writing to be a lot of telling and not showing. There was a lot of creating suspense through omission of information, and then the dialogue was, no one talks like this, and he also tried to create suspense and tension through the dialogue. So yeah, I struggled a lot with this first book, but with the full awareness that I am hoping the rest of the series takes. I know that the writing style is not going to change, that's just something that I'm going to have to deal with, but I am hoping that we have a different sort of plot, one that makes this series its own thing instead of it just being a replica of classic fantasy. And while we're at it, I have also then been able to adjust my expectations to understand that this is a plot-driven story instead of a character-driven story. When you open it, it seems very much like it's going to be a character-driven story, which had me investing myself in the characters, but it's not. It's actually a plot-driven story. So I have now been able to recalibrate my brain for book 2, and hopefully I will be able to enjoy the second and third books more. And if you thought this month of Readalongs has been a terrible month of Readalongs, let me present unto you A Time of Courage by John Gwynne. This one is the third and final book in the Of Blood and Bone trilogy, the last book currently out in the Banished Lands. I loved this series so much. I will happily blaspheme and say I actually like Of Blood and Bone more than Faithful and the Fallen. I think that is potentially because we already have this established world, you already have the connection to this world, that then with all of this series is you're just going back into it and you're seeing how time has affected that, seeing how people think of these characters that we were reading in the original series, and it's got the nostalgia to it that I think makes it more endearing. I love this series so much. This series is set 100 years after the first book in The Faithful and the Fallen, and in it we are following a few different perspectives when it seems that the Kadoshim, some evil monstrous beings, seem to be, the remnants of them from the previous wars still seem to be lurking about, and they seem to be amassing. They seem to be gathering together as though something were to happen. This land is ruled over by the Ben Elim, who are these angels, and they are these all-powerful-ish beings who do not have human sentiment. We have these people across the country who are dealing with these new amassing changes that seem to be happening across the landscape. And I love this series. I love the characters in it, and John Gwynne is masterful at writing non-toxic men. In the same essence as Tolkien, where you have men who are very manly, they are the epitome of manly men. No one is going to question how manly they are, and yet they are kind and compassionate. They care about their friends. They are affectionate. They treat women as equals and with respect. They are Aragorn. They are the epitome of the right kind of men. Not all of them, obviously, because not everyone's the right kind of men, but he writes such nuanced and different kinds of men, and I really love that. And I also think that he did a really good job of writing women. I do actually think that he has done an even better job in this one than in The Faithful and the Fallen, and I really appreciate that as well, because I know that men struggle writing women for some reason. So yeah, I had an amazing time with this series. I loved joining the read-along as well, because I could join in with some lovely people to chat to about these, but I am so sad that the series is done because I was having such a wonderful time with it. Now getting into the series that I read, the first series that I have to talk about is the Age of Darkness series by Stephen Arion. This is a trilogy. It's actually Stephen's debut trilogy, and in it we have Battle Mage, Blood Mage, and Chaos Mage. Unlike how I normally do, where I just talk about the trilogy as a whole, I will talk briefly about the individual books because they do have a somewhat different essence to them. Although they are all very decisively a series, then I would highly recommend you read them in the corresponding order. They do have a different subgenre to each of them, which was a very fascinating approach. The first one I have is Battle Mage, and this is book 1, and this is epic fantasy. This is epic military fantasy, if anything. In it, we are following a kingdom that is under attack from external forces, and we have different people and their different positions within this war. The first one we have is Balthus, who is a mage, and he is afraid that there is hatred towards his kind because the largest foe of the opposing army is a very, very powerful wizard. And he knows that this is going to then be damaging to the reputation of other wizards because people will begin to fear them. But he fights nonetheless to try and save his people and his homeland. Another character that we are following is Vargas, who is a soldier. While mages are raining lightning down from the skies, he is there amongst his brethren fighting for their cause. And the last one that we have is Talandra, who is the daughter of the king. She is a master of espionage and she is determined to help her father win this war. This was an incredible first book because this book starts the series where a series would normally end. It starts with the war, with the conflict, and then afterwards you deal with the aftermath, whichever way the war goes. And I really appreciated the way that Stephen approached this. We're introduced to the characters, to the world, and we are given a reason why the strife will continue throughout the rest of the series. And I really, really admired that. Book 2 is Blood Mage, and book 2 has a Dickensian-esque vibe in terms of dank streets and criminal underbellies mixed with a murder mystery epic fantasy. So many things going on in this one. Absolutely wonderful storytelling because we have got this really dark criminal underbelly. You are following both law enforcement and criminals as we need to discover a string of events that are happening that need to be investigated. And we are following 4 characters. The first one is basically an investigator or a cop who is trying to uncover what happened to a string of corpses that have been drained of all life. We are following Frey, who is the son of a cop who has these magical skills that basically would be very helpful for this investigation. So he gets recruited by his father's old partner. We have Chus, who is an underground fighter who is trying to diffuse the brewing tensions of basically territory wars. And we have Katia, who is a spy for the queen, who is trying to prevent her assassination. This is just, it's a really, really fun, faster paced, grittier book compared to the first one that is more like epic in scope. This one's closed in scope comparatively, and yet the stakes are still high and the tension is still really good, and you can still see the way that the repercussions of the previous book are unfolding, and it's fascinating, and I had an amazing time with this one. And the third and final book is Chaos Mage. This one is a supernatural horror style fantasy. In it, we have these zombie-like creatures, the undead, who are basically besieging this city. And we have different people who are trying their best to save this city. We have Tammy, who is an investigator who is trying to investigate the root cause of the issue. We have Xana, who is trying to pay penance for her war crimes. And we have Balthus, again from book 1, who is a scholar, traveler, and battle mage. This third and final book really did bring the series together really nicely and also set up for the sequel series in a really interesting way. I really loved the way that each book embodied a different subgenre so well, and I think that this was a prime example of Stephen's abilities, and I would highly recommend you check it out if it sounds like it's your thing. Each book keeps it fresh because of these different subgenres that you have thrown in. The way that different characters are very unique to themselves, they feel like real people. You can tell a lot of work has gone into making these characters feel like an individual person, someone you could actually get to know. There's a ton of representation in these books. You have what is clear neurodivergent representation in a couple of the characters, as well as there's a queer character in every single book. We have both bi and gay representation in here. I think that it's one of those that it goes underhyped in my opinion because it is very innovative, and I read some reviews that said that it didn't feel that unique, but the thing is what makes the series unique. Maybe it doesn't make any individual book unique, but the series as a whole therefore is incredibly new and fresh because each book has this epitome of its subgenre, and yet it manages to interlink the entire trilogy so well, and I had a really good time with it, and I would highly recommend. But for those of you who prefer a more traditional beginning, middle, end style trilogy, we have The Age of Dread, which is the sequel series to The Age of Darkness. There are, again, the 3 books. We have Mageborn, Magefall, and Magebane. This one is a typical trilogy, so I will just talk about all of them. This series is set a few years, I think probably about a decade after the original trilogy. We are following several characters who are in the Red Tower, which is where mages convene. The Red Tower had been essentially defunct. It had ceased to be used for a really long time until after the war, when mages began to create suspicion because of people's fear of them. It was somewhere where children could be safe and could learn their magic without harming others. We have a new setup here at the Red Tower. We have to contend with those who believe that magic should be eradicated, because the way to eradicate magic would be to eradicate all magic users. So it is this long conflict of what is right and what is wrong, understanding why people would fear people who have supernatural abilities, people who have much higher abilities than your own, and a fear that you could be manipulated. We have seen the devastation that magic can cause. It's not that people are unreasonable in their fear of magic at times, but the approach to it and the design to try and eradicate it through the murder of innocent children, etc., is where the conflict occurs throughout this series. The ideals of this thing equals bad, and therefore everyone who touches it must inherently be bad. And it's a conflict of morals and ethics, all while being understanding of both parties. And I think it was handled in a really fascinating way. Again, one of the things that I really love about a sequel series, and the same can be said for Of Blood and Bone, is that a lot of the time with fantasy series, you have all of these big showdowns in the last book that make for this big epic conclusion to the trilogy. But what will happen is then you just get like an epilogue of everyone's happy, and then you don't see the repercussions. You don't see what happens decades upon decades later. You know, we're still seeing the repercussions of World War II to an extent. So it takes a long time to deal with the repercussions. And I think that a sequel series like Age of Dread or Of Blood and Bone are really good at displaying that just because we won the battle or even won the war doesn't mean that society hasn't changed and that we don't need to contend with that as well. So I think that Stephen did a fantastic job of following up this series and actually giving us some answers about the potential repercussions that have happened. Arguably that would be infinite. He could do a whole other series, and I would love to read it on the repercussions after this trilogy. But I do think that some really important things were tackled in this that I don't really want to talk about, because I don't want to spoil the original series, and then obviously because it happens later on in the series, spoil the first few books. But I think that things were handled in a really interesting way, not in a neat way necessarily, but in an interesting way, in a way that it does make you think about how actions on this scale do have almost everlasting repercussions. So I was very glad to have read this series, and I think that more people, again, should be just checking out these books because they are woefully underhyped. That is it. That's all I've read. I didn't read any digital books. I was on the risk of migraines quite frequently. We had a lot of humidity, which really messes with me. Also, towards the end of the month and the beginning of this month, I have also had a infection in my wisdom tooth. So I have been heavily drugged, which means that the reading has been a bit skewed. But I am very glad of everything that I read, and I have read some banging books. I have read some duds, but I have read some banging books. So let me know how your August went and what your favorite read of August was. Mine was probably A Time of Courage, just because of, you know, it's the 7th book in that series. It was a lot of build up to get to that point. But also potentially also Chaos Mage, because that was a banging book. But yeah, that is all for me for today. So thank you ever so much for watching, and I will hopefully catch you in another one soon. Bye.